Next, we're going to add some tests for our list ingredients API that we're going to be adding in a moment. So what we'll do is we'll open up our file explorer here, and we are going to open up the recipe app and then tests, and then inside this directory we're going to create a new module and we're going to call it test ingredients API.py. Okay, and then at the top of the module we'll add the docstring tests for the ingredients API. And then we'll do from django.contrib.auth import get user model. And then from django.urls import reverse. And from django.test import test case. We'll do from REST framework import status, and from REST framework.test import API client. From core.models import ingredients, and then from recipe.serializers import ingredient serializer. Okay, so we have everything here. The only thing that we haven't added so far is the ingredient serializer. Everything else is available. We've got get user model to get the model, reverse, test case. These are all things that we've been using in all of the tests, and status and API client for checking the status code and for the API test client. And then we got our new ingredient model, which we're going to use for the test, and also the ingredient serializer, which we're going to be creating in a bit. Now we can go ahead and define the URL of the API we're testing. So that's going to be the ingredients URL that we're going to be adding. So we'll type ingredients URL equals reverse recipe ingredient list. Then we are going to add a function that allows us to create a user, just a helper function. So def create user. Email equals user@example.com, and password equals test pass 123. And we'll do create and return user. We return get user model .objects.create user, email equals email, and password equals password. Okay, so now we're going to add the public ingredients API test, and these are the tests for the unauthenticated API. So we'll do class public ingredients API tests, test case, test unauthenticated, that's a fun word to spell on the fly, API requests, and then def set up self.client equals API client, def test auth required self. Test auth is required for retrieving ingredients, and then res equals self.client.get ingredients URL, and then self.assert equal res.status code status.http 401 unauthorized. Okay, so this test just tests that authentication is required for the endpoint. We're simply making a request to the endpoint before we've authenticated, and we're checking that it returns an unauthorized response. That's everything for the public ingredients API test. Now we'll move on to the private tests. So scroll down a little bit, create a new test class private ingredients API tests, test case, test unauthenticated API requests. So now we're going to start with def setup. I'm going to do a little setup here, and the setup is going to be self.user equals create user for a sample user. Oops, there shouldn't be a question mark there. And then self.client equals API client, and self.client or self.client.force authenticate self.user. Okay, so now we are all set up and ready to do our authenticated API tests. So the first test we'll do is just retrieving a list of ingredients. So df test retrieve ingredients. We're not doing camel case in here. Self test retrieving a list of ingredients. Okay, and then we'll do ingredient.objects.create use equals self.user, name equals kale. And then ingredient.objects.create use equals self.user, name equals vanilla. So we have two sample ingredients that we can test with. Now we'll do res equals self.client.get ingredients API. Sorry, ingredients URL. And this is the URL to the ingredients API that we're going to be adding. Next, we'll do our assertion. So we're going to retrieve all the ingredients that exist in the database. And as I mentioned before, for every single test that's run, the database is entirely refreshed. So the only things that are going to exist in the database for this particular test case is an empty database plus whatever we have in setup. So that will be our user. So what this means is we can just retrieve a list of all of the ingredients in the database. We can pass it to the serializer and we can use that to validate that the API is returning the correct result. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll type ingredients equals ingredient.objects.all, and we'll just specify the order that we expect it in. So we expect it to be ordered by and then name in reverse. Now, of course, you could change this to a different type of order if you wanted, but usually it makes sense to order it in alphabetical order. So then what we'll do is serializer equals ingredient serializer, which again, we haven't created this yet, but we're going to do it shortly. Ingredients many equals true. So we're passing in all the ingredients that we returned on line 52, and we're passing in many equals true to say that we want to serialize many different items instead of just one single item. So basically it's just a list of items instead of just an object, which is the item. Now we're going to do self.assert equal res.status code is status.http 200 OK, because that's the status code we expect. And then we're going to do self.assert equals self.assert equal res.data should be the same as serializer.data. All right, so that's everything for the retrieve test. I'm just going to add one more test, which is the limited to user test. So if we come down to a new line here, and we'll do df test ingredients limited to user self, and then test list of ingredients is limited to authenticated user. So now we're going to add another user, user2 equals create user, and the email equals user2@example.com. Ingredients.objects.create user equals user2 and name equals salt. And then ingredient equals ingredient.objects.create user equals self.user, name equals pepper. So what we're doing is we're creating a new user and an ingredient for that user, and we're going to use that for the tests. What I'll do is I'll just type out the entire test and I will talk through it. Do res equals self.client.get ingredients URL, and then self.assert equal res.status code status.http 200 OK, self.assert equal len res.data should be 1, and self.assert equal res.data name, and then ingredient dot name, and self.assert equal res.data 0 ID should be the same as ingredient test.id. Okay, so here we have our new test. So on line 59, we are adding a new user. So we're creating a second user, which we are not authenticated with. And then we're creating an ingredient for that user on line 60. And we're not assigning that value to anything because we don't need to for the test. All we need to do is ensure that there's only one result returned, and that result is the only ingredient that was assigned to the user that we're authenticated with. So on line 61, we're creating another ingredient called pepper, which is assigned to the authenticated user that we access through self.user. Then we are calling on line 63, we're calling the get method to do a HTTP get on the ingredients URL. It gets a list of all the ingredients for the authenticated user. We're checking that the status code is 200 OK. And then we're checking on line 66 that the length of the result was 1. So because we created two different ingredients, but only one was assigned to the authenticated user, we would expect only one to be returned. And that's kind of the essence of this test right here. Then just to make sure that it's not only returning the ingredient linked to the user, but also the correct ingredient, so it's not returning an ingredient linked to another user, on line 67 and 68, we are checking the name and the ID of the recipe that was returned. So that's everything for our tests. Let's go ahead and save the file quickly. Go ahead and run the tests. Check that they fail. They'll probably fail saying that the serializer cannot be imported because we haven't created the serializer yet. Okay, here we go. So it says no module name test framework. So it looks like I misspelled test instead of REST. So here it should be REST framework. If you spotted that, then good for you. If not, then apologies. Let's go up and correct this now. So it should be from REST framework, import status. And this is why it's good to pay attention to not just if the test passes or fails, but also what the error was. Like, was the error what you expected it to be? Does the error make sense to you? In this case, we managed to figure out from the error that it was actually just a typo. So now if we run it again, we should see it fail for a different reason. Okay, this looks better. It says it failed because it cannot import the ingredient serializer, which we haven't created yet. So that makes sense. And we can now be confident that the tests seem to be running okay. Next, we're going to move on to actually implement this ingredient serializer and make the test pass.